In this lecture video, I'm going to be looking at Robert Nozick's argument as to why the minimal state enables a kind of framework for utopia. So he both criticizes utopian political philosophy, we could say utopian theories of justice, but also offers a way in which his libertarianism enables a kind of trying out of different possible utopias in case ultimately maybe there is one genuine utopia. So Nozick begins by establishing a kind of model in the abstract of utopia, and he says that if there is to be a utopia, it must be the best world imaginable for all of us, right? For everyone. So it has to be the kind of world which would apply to all beings and is the best world, best suited for all beings, maximizes all the potential goods of all beings. Now, if we try to imagine this, he says, then we would imagine a possible world with rational creatures, each of which has the possibility to imagine a possible world to live in. So basically, this utopia would consist of creatures like us, who have the capability of imagination and who can, incidentally, in that world, imagine what they think would be the best possible of all worlds. Now, the other inhabitants of this world may choose then to leave your world, the world that you think is a utopia, and therefore create their own with other similar rational creatures, because each individual has the capacity to imagine what would be the best possible world for all of us. Now, assume this process goes on indefinitely, where every individual kind of imagines their own possible world with similar rational creatures in it, but in each world you have those rational creatures who can do the same, so on and so on, right? So it would go on indefinitely. Now, if you're imagining this, put that to the side. What we're thinking about when we think about utopia is a presumably stable world. A world in which, there isn't collapse, or it doesn't dissolve or disintegrate. Now, if there are stable worlds, then none of the inhabitants in that world can imagine an alternative world they would rather live in, because that would end up ultimately making them want to try to create or establish that other world and dissolve the current one they live in. If that's the case, then no member of a stable association can imagine another association which they believe would be stable that they would rather be a member of. So basically it would be the case that, well, if you had, if you tried to imagine utopia which contained rational beings, maybe we could just say they're human beings, well, human beings contain the possibility of imagination, to imagine other worlds where they might think is utopia. In so doing, then every individual can imagine leaving that world for a new one that they think is better. If that's the case, then no utopia can be stable, because it could always possibly be dissolved by individuals choosing to live in a different state of affairs. That means there could be no stable utopia. So Nozick's point here is that the totality of conditions that we wish to impose on societies which are to qualify as utopias are inconsistent, because they can't be stable. They can't be stable if we choose to have utopia inhabited by rational creatures. Now, what if those rational creatures didn't have the possibility to imagine other possible worlds, or their own versions of utopia? Well, he says the world cannot be imagined so that it logically follows that, 1, its inhabitants, or one of them, most or the nthmost of them, want to live in it, or 2, its inhabitants, or one of them, most or nthmost, will want to live in a world with a certain kind of person and will do whatever they say, and so on. So it can't be the case that both, basically, those individuals, those rational creatures, do want to live in it, the one single world, because to be a rational creature means that they have the possibility to imagine other kinds of worlds that they might desire more, or that those inhabitants wouldn't want to live in another world, that they would just live according to the rules that are established by that vision of utopia. Because in that case, they wouldn't be a rational creature. So you'd basically have to take away the ability for people to imagine a better world, to imagine something that maybe fulfills their desires, the kind of goods they want to pursue that are different from other individuals. So if this is the case, then again, you can't really have this utopia that is universal, but which is supposed to be what a utopia is. It is the best possible world for all of us. It's the one most desirable. If that's the case, then it doesn't seem like a stable world is possible at all. And what Nozick says is that since a person wishes to maximize what he gets rather than what he's given, no person will imagine a maximally appreciative world of inferior beings to whose existence he is crucial. No one will choose to be a queen bee. Nor will a stable association consist of narcissistic persons competing for primacy along the same dimensions. Rather, it will contain a diversity of persons with a diversity of excellencies and talents, each benefiting from living with others, complementing them. And each person prefers being surrounded by a galaxy of persons of diverse excellence and talent equal to his own, to the alternative of being the only shining light in a pool of relative mediocrity. All admire each other's individuality, basking in the full development in other aspects and potentialities of themselves left relatively undeveloped. So, perhaps there might be a stable world, but it would only be one that would allow for everyone to develop their own individual capacities, to choose kind of their own paths in life. So why would no one choose to be the kind of queen bee, the architect of utopia in charge of determining kind of what the regulations of that society are? Well, because if you have rational creatures that can imagine utopia, their own visions of the best possible society, well, then they might they might decide not to consent to living under the rule of that queen bee. In the same case, why it wouldn't make sense that a stable association would consist of narcissistic individuals, because then they're going to be competing for primacy, which is going to make that world unstable. So if you have rational creatures that are capable of voluntarily pursuing those goods which they see as most desirable, then you're basically going to get a kind of a free market where individuals are going to pursue those worlds which they see as most reflecting their vision of utopia. So you're going to kind of get a competition among the best possible worlds. Some worlds then might be desirable. Then they might, over time, another world might pop up that's better, that people might choose to go live in. So then that previously, considered best world might dissolve. And in that case, you're not going to have a stable world. Now, again, it might be possible that you could have a stable world in the end, but only if it allows individuals, to complement each other, to complement each other's individuality, and full development of all their capacities and potentialities that they see as reflective of who they want to be or what they desire. Nozick then applies this very abstract model of what the nature of utopia must be, or would ultimately result in, to the real world. And he makes 4 points about this. First, unlike the model, in the real world, we can't create all the people whose existence we desire. So we can't kind of create a utopia in the real world where people have a specific kind of nature that makes it so that they behave in ways that fulfill the kind of outline of that best possible society. In the real world, you have people as they are, and you have a plurality, right, of different kinds of beliefs, desires, and so on. Secondly, unlike the model, in the actual world, communities impinge upon one another. which creates problems of foreign relations, resulting in questions about self-defense and necessitating modes of adjudicating and resolving disputes between the communities. Right? I'm reminded of, in the case of Plato's Republic, in the second book, when they begin expanding the city needing more resources starts to come into contact with other cities where they also need resources as well, and that's going to result in conflict that in one way or another is going to need to, hopefully be resolved. And that, of course, is not indicative of a utopia. We don't talk about conflict in a utopia because a utopia is supposed to transcend those kinds of problems. Now, third, in the actual world, there are information costs in finding out what other communities there are and what they are like, and moving and travel costs in going from one community to another. So it can't just be as simple as, you like that other world, it's more desirable, you're there, right? Bish bosh, no problem. We have moving costs. We have the fact that in the real world we're kind of rooted in our communities. A sense of spiritual belonging, perhaps, to certain communities that we might not even want to move, even if we think another world might be better to live in. And fourth, in the actual world, some communities may try to keep some of their members ignorant of the nature of other alternative communities they might join, to try to prevent them from freely leaving their own community to join another. I'm thinking of, the classical examples that are taught in the West about, East Berlin trying to keep people from leaving to go to West Berlin. Maybe think of North Korea or those kinds of examples, whether or not they're entirely accurate or not. Right? The idea is in the real world, it's not so simple as everybody has full knowledge about what it would be like to live in different societies. There are all kinds of barriers erected, oftentimes by governments, to prevent kind of the free migration of peoples from occurring. Because of this, Nozick says there must be many different paths that lead to utopia, because it's not clear that any one individual can have knowledge of the greatest possible world for all, for the problem of, stable worlds that we were looking at. And beyond that, in the abstract, in thinking about kind of the nature of utopia, it's even more difficult to try to, even if there were this stable world, realize it in the real world. So we have to basically, Nozick thinks, think about utopia in a way that's a kind of experimentation, where we think about where we want to work towards utopia, but we do so by experimenting. And we want then to be as many numbers of experiments as possible. Nozick gives 3 reasons for this. The first reason is that people are different. Not everybody shares the same beliefs. He says that people differ in temperament, in interests, intellectual ability, in aspirations, natural bent, spiritual quests, and the kind of life that they wish to lead. If you have all these kind of differences among human beings, it doesn't make sense why you would want to kind of shave all that down to one common denominator. For each person, Nozick thinks, there's a kind of life that is objectively the best for them. In the sense of, let's say if someone is Catholic, there's a certain kind of life that's going to be better for them than the kind of life that might be advocated or lived out by a Buddhist, say. Additionally, for each person, so far as objective criteria of goodness can tell, there is a wide range of very different kinds of life that tie as best. So it's not clear, Nozick thinks, that there is ultimately one kind of life that is best. It seems like there are many that are equally just as good. And so it would make sense then to allow people to choose which of those, seemingly equally good lives that they could lead. Nozick says, the conclusion to draw is that there will not be one kind of community existing and one kind of life led in utopia. Utopia will consist of utopias, of many different divergent communities in which people lead different kinds of lives under different institutions. Utopia is a framework for utopias, a place where people are at liberty to join together voluntarily to pursue and attempt to realize their own vision of the good life in the ideal community, but where but where no one can impose his own vision upon others. Okay. The second reason that there must be many different paths leading to utopia, according to Nozick, is that there is little reason to believe that one unique system of trade-offs will command universal assent. So there's not a good reason, he thinks, to believe that you can have kind of one system that's able to say, well, yeah, group A really prefers like activity B, and C prefers activity D. So maybe we can have a system where we allow everyone to engage in activity E because B and D are incompatible, and so D would be second best choice for both of them. There's not reason to believe that that would be desirable, to pursue their second best option as to their best option if, let's say, those things that they pursue are incompatible. Nozick says you have different communities, each with a slightly different mix that will provide a range from which each individual can choose that community which best approximates his balance among competing values. So it doesn't make sense to think that there can be one kind of system that, it's almost like a bipartisan compromise where you have politicians that say, well, nobody got what they want, but that's kind of the good of the deal. That's not what utopia is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be some kind of compromise. Utopia is the best possible imaginable world. It's the most practical world, right? That's not the idea behind utopia. And the third reason Nozick gives for why there must be many different paths leading to utopia is that people are complex. Now, it's not just complex in that they have different kinds of beliefs and values and pursuits and things, right? But it's just the characters of individuals are different. Now, suppose that there is a one best society for all that can account for, let's say, all the different characteristics of individuals. Nozick wants to know, how could we discover this? Right, so this is an epistemic question. Nozick proposes two ways. The first, design devices. So these construct a procedure to arrive at an end. This is kind of like constructivism. So like in Rawls, for example, you have a constructivist procedure, which would be the original position, that sets out a certain end it wants to achieve, right? What would be principles of justice that could be unanimously agreed to, and then it tries to construct a procedure that allows that to happen. Now, of that, of a kind of design device, Nozick says of this that it is enormously unlikely that, even if there were one ideal pattern for a society, it could be arrived at in this a priori fashion. So it's not clear that you can arrive at it in this way where you can just, think about what that end is you want and then what's the best procedure to know if it's possible or not. Especially because Nozick is going to say, well, one, there are all kinds of disagreements with Rawls, for example, and his constructivist procedure as to whether it does lead to an ideally just background condition for society. But there's also the problem that it's not entirely clear that not just that the end result we might think is unjust or just, but it's not entirely clear that you could have one that isn't influenced by empirical facts. And this is actually a debate in Rawls as to what extent the original position is influenced after the fact. Right? There are these 4 different levels of slowly lifting the veil of ignorance, for example. And does that mean then there's a kind of feedback loop that occurs such that, well, the kind of knowledge that's discovered in the original position as to what the principles of justice might be are continually open to revision. If that's the case, then, well, how could you use a design device to arrive at utopia in an a priori fashion? It doesn't seem clear. So instead, Nozick advocates what he calls filter devices. Now, these involve a process which eliminates many from a large set of alternatives. So he says, but one cannot determine in advance which people will come up with the best ideas, and all ideas must be tried out, and not merely simulated on a computer, to see how they will work. If these ideas must be tried out, there must be many communities trying out different patterns. Each community must win and hold the voluntary adherence of its members. No pattern is imposed on everyone, and the result will be one pattern if and only if everyone voluntarily chooses to live in accordance with that pattern of community. In other words, we can think of a filter device as like the market. People come up with new products, they put it on the market. If people like it, they voluntarily buy it, and that product becomes successful. If they don't like it, well, then maybe the seller stops selling that product. Maybe they go out of business. It wasn't a good product. So Nozick thinks of Utopia as a kind of marketplace. A marketplace of ideas. We test out different ideas. We test out different ways of living. And we see what are the ones that people voluntarily pursue. What are the ones that people voluntarily engage in? What are the more successful ones? That's how we try to determine what utopia might be, through a market-like transactional process. So there are three different utopian positions, Nozick says. The first is imperialistic utopianism. So this countenances the forcing of everyone into one pattern of community. And we might think of this as a kind of dystopian situation, in the sense that, well, it's going to say that whatever utopia is, it's going to have to be achieved through a kind of dictatorship, where someone's going to have to come along and force everybody to behave in a way that makes possible utopia. Now, missionary utopianism is not achieved by force. It's achieved by persuasion, through the dissemination of ideas. So this hopes to persuade everyone or convince everyone to live in one particular kind of community, but will not force them to do so. We can think of this as kind of the way that the utopian socialists thought about utopia, as trying to persuade everybody rationally that reason would see this is the best way to live, and everybody would slowly kind of accept this and start living this way. Now, the kind of utopian position that Nozick advocates, he calls existential utopianism. So this hopes that a particular pattern of community will exist, though not necessarily universal, so that those who wish to do so may live in accordance with it. So existential utopians don't necessarily try to go around persuading everyone, and they don't even necessarily think it might be the case that their conception of utopia is universal. They just try to live it their own way, and if others want to come along and join and live that utopia as well, then they're welcome to, as long as it's voluntary. Nozick thinks there's a kind of affiliation between the missionary utopianism and existential utopianism, insofar as the missionary utopians could as well kind of engage in that kind of existential utopianism, but the difference is they're a priori sure of their utopianism, whereas the existential utopians are not, and the existential utopianisms aren't ultimately interested in proselytizing necessarily. So this comes full circle in Nozick's political philosophy. In Anarchy, State, and Utopia, right, Nozick argues the only state that is legitimate is the minimal state, and that the only state that is legitimate is the minimal state, and that it is the only state that is just. Nothing more like the welfare state, a socialist state, whatever, that's unjust. And some people might see this as kind of pessimistic. We can't do better than the minimal state. Or it's not morally permissible to do anything more than the minimal state. But Nozick wants to show here actually the minimal state is inspiring, because it is the minimal state that is the framework for utopia. Because since the minimal state protects our most basic rights, it enables individuals to voluntarily engage in any kinds of transactions they want. It allows individuals to enter into any kind of an association voluntarily and leave that association if they find a better one. So it is only, according to Nozick, the minimal state that allows us to pursue utopia. He says, the minimal state treats us as inviolate individuals who may not be used in certain ways by others as means or tools or instruments or resources. It treats us as persons having individual rights with the dignity this constitutes, treating us with respect by respecting our rights. It allows us, individuals or with whom we choose, to choose our life and to realize our ends and our conception of ourselves insofar as we can, aided by the voluntary cooperation of other individuals possessing the same dignity. How dare any state or group of individuals do more or less? I think the question that arises with Nozick's conception of the minimal state being a kind of framework for utopia, not being a utopia, but a framework for how we can discover utopia through a kind of trial and error process in a kind of marketplace. I think the question that arises is whether the best possible ideas can arise in a market format. Because what's going to happen is, in a marketplace, that which has value is that which it can be commodified. Because that's what's traded ultimately in a marketplace. And this is a question, think about in education. Is it best to run education, as like a business? Is it best to think of education as a kind of commodity? Or does that kind of a priori determine what our ideals and pursuits are? So does it truly allow us to pursue anything we want, or only what a marketplace finds valuable? Would that be a problem for thinking of the minimal state as a framework for utopia and the ability to pursue utopia freely?